The following is a paid program for the Marianne Williamson for President campaign. The opinions expressed aren't necessarily those of this station.
Marianne, as you know, is an internationally acclaimed lecturer, activist, and author of 4 #1 New York Times best-selling books. She has been one of America's most well-known public voices for more than 3 decades. 7 of her 12 published books have been New York Times bestsellers, and Marianne has been a popular guest on television programs such as Oprah, Good Morning America, and Bill Maher. Marianne Williamson was one of the first Democratic Party candidates to declare for the office of President of the United States and made Fairfield part of her campaign launch in November of 2018. Since that time, she has visited all of the early primary states, holding meetings and rallies and building momentum for her national run. Marianne is running for president because her vision is clear about what priorities our country needs to set to be a strong nation. We'll hear that vision tonight, so please help me welcome my dear friend and a good friend of Fairfield, Democratic candidate for the presidency of the United States, Marianne Williamson.
Thank you, and thank you. Thank you to those of you who are watching on live stream. Those who are watching from wherever you are joining with those of us here in Iowa for a conversation about something very, very important, and that is our country. Our political conversation doesn't match, in my mind, the depth of who we are. I read a story once about President Teddy Roosevelt, and when he would have guests at his home, he would ask everybody to go outside late at night, and he'd have everybody look up at the stars and just gaze at them. And then after a few minutes, he'd say, "Okay, I think we feel insignificant enough now. Now we can go to bed." You don't have to be a religious person to stand in awe before the fact that there's even life on this planet. You don't have to be a religious person or even think of yourself as a spiritual person to appreciate the depth of the mystery that life is. But when you do appreciate those things and you do stand in awe before the mystery of life, you are grounded in a different place within yourself. And it is only in that place that we can find our wisdom. And it's only in that place that we can find our nobility. And it's only in that place that we can find our higher intelligence. Now, a lot of people in America, some of the best and the brightest, some of the most passionate, some of the people most concerned with things that matter in this world, are the least involved in politics now, because our politics has become so toxic, and our politics has become dangerously superficial. And our politics has become not just corrupted in terms of the way our government functions, that we all know, but it has become corrupted psychologically, emotionally, and spiritually, because we don't even embark on political conversations from the place of our wisdom. And so because we don't embark on the conversation itself from a place that is wise, we don't have the power to deal with all that corruption. And that is dangerous, because our government is corrupt today, and our democracy is eroding today. And life on earth, if we do not change the trajectory of the way we are behaving as a human race, is possibly in peril over the next 50 and 100 years. So we can talk about the issues, but if we only talk about the issues, and I'm certainly prepared to do that, but if we only talk about what we call the political issues on the level of externals, then all we're doing is talking about the symptoms. We're not talking about the causes. All we're doing is watering the leaves of our democracy, but we're not watering our democracy at its roots. And what does that mean? Well, for those of us who wish to see someone other than Donald Trump be president in 2020, we should ask ourselves, could we defeat Donald Trump that way? Well, we could possibly defeat Trump that way. Some people think that what we need is just somebody tough enough, somebody fierce enough to bring him down. I think anybody who thinks it's as simple as that is very naive about the nature of this opponent. And if that's all we're successful in doing, then the real opponents of democracy, which are far larger than just President Trump, will be so back in 22, and they'll be so back in 24. Now, we have to do more than pull back from the cliff, ladies and gentlemen. We need to get away from the vicinity of the cliff. And the only way we can get away from the vicinity of the cliff is if we do something much more than bring Donald Trump down. That's such a high school concept. We got to bring him down. No, ladies and gentlemen, we got to do more than bring Trump down. We've got to bring America up. And the only way we can bring America up, is if we rise up ourselves. We rise up out of this superficial, silly, childish, immature high school conversation that passes for politics today. And so I ask you, to grow wise with me. I ask you to go into the depth of your heart and talk with me about what is happening in our country, what is happening in the human race. We have to have a very deep conversation now about democracy. We have to have a very deep conversation about our economic system. We have to have a very deep conversation about capitalism. We have to have a very deep conversation about what it means, our relationship to each other, what should be our social contract between the citizens of a democracy and our government. What should be the contract? What should be the emotional and psychological connection between us and other nations? How do we reclaim a primal relationship of righteousness with the earth itself, and with our food, and with our ancestors, and with our descendants? So join with me, if you will, in a conversation about the deeper spiritual roots of our country. Because it's like when you go to therapy and you try to figure out what's happened in your childhood, you try to figure out your family history. Because when you go to therapy and you're trying to figure out your family history, you're trying to figure out where you fit in. That's why we study history, not just of the family, but of nations. That's why you can't just read a novel from the middle. You can't just pick up a novel and read it from the middle. You don't know who the characters are. You don't know what the plot is. And that's what has happened in America. We've lost the plot. We've lost the plot of this extraordinary narrative that is American history. We've lost the plot of this extraordinary narrative that is American democracy. And because we've lost a sense of its profundity, we've lost a sense of its meaning, we've lost a sense of its purpose, we've lost a sense of our responsibility to it, we've lost a sense of what it means to honor what our ancestors have done, we've lost a sense of responsibility to our descendants. And so what this campaign is a campaign for something deeper than just winning the presidency in 2020, although I personally think that only a conversation of depth will win this election in 2020. In 1776, our founders, in writing the Declaration of Independence, laid claim to something very radical. It was radical in 1776, and it's radical today. It was a repudiation of aristocracy. And aristocracy and monarchy had dominated Western civilization for centuries. The idea, we were taught this when we were children, was that God had given all rights to the king, the divine right of kings. And the king shared his power, or the queen's power, with their rich friends, the aristocracy. And this small group of people were entitled to everything. They were entitled to the land, and they were entitled to education, and they were entitled to make their dreams come true. They were entitled to do whatever they wanted to do. Nobody else was. The vast, vast majority of people could not have those means of self-actualization. They could not own land, they could not be educated, they could not create wealth, and they could not bequeath whatever they had created to their children. With the founding of this country, we turned that entire paradigm on its ear. And in the Declaration of Independence, it was declared that all men are created equal. All men. And that all men are given by God inalienable rights of life and of liberty and of the pursuit of happiness. And the Declaration says that governments are instituted among men to secure those rights. Now, those words are profound. And if all they are written on marble walls, inscribed on marble, or written on parchment and kept behind glass that we go see in a museum somewhere, that doesn't mean much after a few generations, because they lose their moral force. In the Jewish religion, it is said that every generation must discover God for itself. Every generation of Americans must rediscover for ourselves, what those words mean. Because only if we rediscover for ourselves in our own hearts what they mean do they have moral force. Because only then do the people of the United States find and refine our emotional and psychological and moral and spiritual connection to those principles. Only then do we find that place in ourselves where we are willing to stand for those principles, to struggle for those principles, to know when those principles are being transgressed against, and to be willing to rise up and say, stop right there when somebody's coming after it. Now, that's where the story began, but as we know, it gets gnarlier and gnarlier. Because 41 signers of that declaration, it's so ironic because these men, by signing that declaration, were themselves committing treason against the King of England. If the war had gone differently, if the British had won, then the men who signed the Declaration of Independence would have been hanged. They would have been executed as traitors. So they knew they were risking their lives to sign it. So on one hand, these men gave this extraordinary gift to all of us and infused the founding of our nation with the most enlightened principles that had ever informed the founding of a nation in history. But 41 of them were slave owners. So that's how it all began. The tension was there at the beginning. The dichotomy was there at the beginning. The polarity was there at the beginning between the fact that on one hand, there are these extraordinarily enlightened, extraordinarily illumined principles, radical in nature, extraordinary in what they mean in terms of the possibilities for humanity to soar, for any person to soar, that any person could have rights to be who they want to be, do what they want to do, actualize whatever their God-given potential, and that government would not lord over them, but that government would be there to support those rights. We have been that. We aspire to be that throughout our history. And yet, from our very beginning, we have also contained as a nation people and forces which have and who have directly transgressed against those principles. That was there in 1776. It has been there in every single generation. The narrative of American history is that at every time in our history, there have been those whose hearts were ablaze, who did grasp, people who understood how extraordinary a gift it is to us and to the entire world, that there should be a country founded on the notion that all should be able to self-actualize and that nobody should stand in their way. And in every generation, there have been those who said, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to have slavery. We're going to have genocide. We're going to have segregation. We're going to have oppression of women. We're going to have institutionalized white supremacy. In every generation, there have been the foes of democracy. And in every generation, there have been those who stood up and said to those foes, you stop right there. And the narrative of American history is that ultimately those who truly love democracy and are willing to stand for democracy and are willing to sacrifice for democracy have won the day. Because we answered slavery with abolition. And we answered the suppression of women with two major waves of feminism and the women's suffragette movement and the passage of the 19th Amendment. We answered the institutionalized white supremacy of the American South and segregation with the civil rights movement. This is not new, ladies and gentlemen, what's happening in our time. This stuff has just come back around again. Once again, we have the foes of genuine democracy. We have those who find real democracy rather inconvenient to their financial purposes. And that's why we don't have universal health care, because God forbid it should cut in to the short-term profits of health insurance companies and big pharma. And we don't have proper gun safety laws because God forbid it should cut into the short-term profits of gun manufacturers. And we don't fight climate change the way we should. Why? Because it might cut in to the short-term profits of fossil fuel companies, and we don't wage peace. We just prepare endlessly for war. Why? Because otherwise, God forbid, it might cut in to the short-term profits of defense contractors. Ladies and gentlemen, this is nothing new. This is just aristocracy again. We're not functioning, you see, as a democracy. We're functioning as a veiled aristocracy. Money's good. We like money. The problem in America is not that people can get rich. It's good that people can get rich in America. The problem is that today, not enough people can get rich. There is a difference between wealth and aristocracy. Wealth means, and many people in America have made great amounts of wealth and have done so righteously. Aristocracy is something different. Aristocracy is where the government functions in such a way as to advocate for the ability of very wealthy people to get even wealthier and make it harder for anybody else to create wealth at all. This kind of tendency is not good for democracy. Louis Brandeis, the late Supreme Court Justice, said that you can either have large amounts of money concentrated in the hands of a very few, or you can have democracy. The foe of democracy today isn't conservative and it isn't liberal. The foe of democracy today is corporatist. The foe of democracy today is that force which mitigates against Abraham Lincoln's statement that a government of the people and by the people and for the people would not perish from the earth. Ladies and gentlemen, it's perishing. Because we are functioning as a government of a few of the people, by a few of the people, for a few of the people, of the corporations, by the corporations, and for the corporations. This is so much bigger than how it affects you. It's so much bigger than how it affects you, and it's so much bigger than how it affects me. It's whether or not we as a generation stand up for this extraordinary possibility of a society in which the values of equality and the values of equal opportunity and the values of the real right of all people to pursue their happiness is something that is safe in the hands of this generation. We're not the first generation to have to face some very, very serious threats to our democracy. Let's just be sure we're not the first generation to wimp out on doing what it takes to get this country back on track. And the last pillar of my campaign is the most, I believe, sobering of all. And that has to do with our national security agenda. Certainly an example of where the traditional political establishment carries on an awfully superficial conversation. Should we bring the troops home? Oh, I don't know. Let's bring all of them home, Joe. Should we? Oh, I don't know. Or if we stay there, I want to know exactly what is our exit strategy. This is like we're in high school. Let's talk for real. The U.S. Air Force has ordered 100 airplanes called the B-21 Raiders. Every B-21 Raider costs $550 million. But it's not just that. Each B-21 Raider carries both conventional and nuclear weapons. So I'd like to ask everybody here, just in case somebody can tell me something I'm not seeing, why do we need 100 airplanes that drop nuclear weapons? You drop 5 of those, it's over for human civilization as we know it, and you drop 10 of those, and it's pretty much over for the human race on this planet for 200, 300,000 years. This has nothing to do, ladies and gentlemen, with keeping us safe. It has everything to do with money for defense contractors, money for the nuclear industry, and so forth. And that, unfortunately, is too endemic of how our national security operates. Because for every dollar we spend on actual peace creation, we spend over $1,000 on ways to prepare for war. Now, I have a lot of respect for the U.S. military. My father fought in World War II, and I think we all should have respect for the U.S. military. This is not a critique of the U.S. military. These decisions are not being made by the U.S. military. These decisions are being made by politicians, and it's no different than everything else I said, whether it's gun safety or universal health insurance, or fighting climate crisis, or national security. Our national security agenda is more dominated by the short-term advocacy for profits for short-term profits for defense contractors than it is for waging peace on this planet. Ronald Rumsfeld, who was the Secretary of Defense under George Bush, said we must wage peace. General Mattis, before he left the Department of Defense, said, if you're not going to fully fund the State Department, I'm going to have to buy more ammunition. The military should be seen like a surgeon. Hey, if we have to have surgery, the United States should have the best surgeon. And no one, I don't think, would argue that we don't need the finest military. But ladies and gentlemen, you can't just take medicine. You have to cultivate health. And you can't just prepare for war. You have to cultivate peace. You can't back yourself up into peace. At what point is this going to change? Just like our economic system has nothing to do with planning great economic vibrancy 10 years from now. If we want economic vibrancy 10 years from now, I'll tell you what you do. Take better care of your 10-year-olds today. That's why I want a massive realignment of investment in the direction of our children. And the same with national security. Are we even talking about how we're going to have peace on this planet 10 years from now, 25 years from now, 50 years from now, 100 years from now? Because if we're going to have peace, if we're going to envision peace, we're going to have an agenda of peace. And if we want an agenda of peace, we're going to have to peace create. And you peace create with 4 main factors, and they're not going to surprise anybody. Expand economic opportunities for women, expand educational opportunities for children, reduce violence against women, and diminish unnecessary human suffering wherever possible. That is the work of the State Department theoretically, but we continue to decrease funding to those kinds of efforts just as we increase funding to the kind of military that many people argue, even from a military standpoint, have very little to do with the kinds of wars that will probably be fought 10, 25, or 50 years from now. I'm sorry, ladies and gentlemen, when it comes to war and peace, when it comes to any of these issues that we've talked about tonight, it is ridiculous, it is naive of us to think that the traditional political establishment is going to address these things at their core. The traditional political establishment, the best it offers is a better version of the same old, same old. If this trajectory is going to be changed, if we're going to have wage peace on this planet, if we're going to have a robust relationship between the State Department and the Defense Department, if we're going to have peace creation in the United States, domestically as well, through something like the United States Department of Peace, I'll tell you what we're going to have to do. The people are going to have to step in. You know, Americans have become, unfortunately, very well aware of the issues having to do with drug addiction, alcoholism, and so forth. And I would say probably most of us have had the experience of either making this call or having someone else make the call to us, where someone says to someone else about a mutual friend or loved one, "You think we ought to do something?" We all know what that means. That means that we know that that person that we love has gone too far. Their drinking, their drug use, and we're really worried. We're worried if we don't do something, that person could die. When it comes to overuse of drugs and overuse of alcohol, we're not naive. We're pretty sophisticated people. We get you cannot consider the survival of the human body just guaranteed. The survival of the body isn't guaranteed. The American people need to awaken from our magical thinking and really get the survival of our democracy is not guaranteed either. And if we continue to behave so recklessly towards our planet, so recklessly towards life itself, so recklessly with issues like war and peace, so recklessly like with the lives of our children, so recklessly with the economic opportunities of too many people who simply cannot make it, who cannot be unleashed. If we continue to behave this irresponsibly and this recklessly, ladies and gentlemen, we will be the generation about which it will one day be said, "God, they blew it." Ladies and gentlemen, let's not blow it. People all over the world know that sometimes Americans are slow to wake up. Many people all over the world roll their eyes about us. God, what are the Americans thinking? But if anybody, including those people, know anything about history, they know this too. Yeah, we're sometimes slow to wake up, but when we do wake up, man, we slam it like nobody's business. And it is time to slam it like nobody's business. And we're not going to slam it, and we're not going to slam it like nobody's business with a little incremental change here and an incremental change there. We need fundamental repair. We need to repeal that 2017 tax bill. We need to repeal these tax cuts for the very, very richest because that is money stolen from everybody else. We need to permanentize the middle class tax cuts. People say, how are you going to pay for all this, Marianne? How are you going to pay for universal health care? How are you going to pay for college education? I'll tell you, you get it from the people who shouldn't have had it to begin with, then you have more. And anyway, where does money come from except people living their dreams? Unleash people's dreams, uncap. Let the American people soar. Remember what democracy is supposed to be about, and then we will have an economy like nobody's business. But we'll have more than an economy like nobody's business. We'll have our democracy back, and we'll have a chance of peace on earth back. And then this generation can say, yeah, we were kind of slow to get there, but we did what Americans sometimes do. We kind of are distracted for a long time. We have a lot of other things to think about. And then all of a sudden, a generation wakes up and goes, whoa, what the hell are they doing? It's time for this generation to do what other generations before us have done and said, we get it. Some things are really, really wrong here. It's time for the people to wake up and not to look at the same group of people whose careers have been entrenched in the limitations of the very mindset that got us here and say, well, they're the only ones who are possibly qualified to get us out of here. The mindset that got us into this ditch is not the mindset that will lead us out of this ditch. I'm sorry, we don't need just a bunch of political mechanics, as good as political mechanics might be, and I have respect for all of them who happen to be running for president, but that's not about that. We need a political visionary more than we need a political mechanic. And that political vision has got to come from each and every one of us. And when Franklin Roosevelt said that the primary role of the US president is moral leadership, I agree with that. And that moral leadership has got to come not just from me or from you, but from all of us. I have spent 35 years helping to empower people and training them to be leaders. For that same period of time, the US government has been busy disempowering people and turning them into followers. I say we should be followers no more. The country belongs to us, and it's time for all of us to remember that and to say so. Thank you very, very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate your being with me here and joining with me in the conversation about things that I think matter. I think our children matter. I think race matters. I think war and peace matters. I think the state of our planet matters. People say, how are you going to pay for all of these things we need to do in terms of climate crisis? I'd rather pay for it with money than pay for it with our lives. And that's really what we're talking about here. We need to become wise, as I said earlier this evening. We need to stop talking about these things like they're just superficial issues, because they're not superficial issues. We have been entrusted with something very, very precious. Like I said, it's more than what you have a right to. It's what we have a responsibility to do, to really connect with our ancestors that way, to really think about what we owe to our descendants. That's the level of conversation that I want to have about politics. That's the conversation that I'm enjoying having with people all around this country, because I think the American people are ready for this. If you make me president, if you feel that in your conscience, and one of the things that I find very profound here in Iowa, it's the same in Nevada, it's the same in New Hampshire, and it's the same in South Carolina, and it's the same in California now, although I'm not sure that people in California have totally awakened to this. But in these other states, the primary states, people certainly have awakened to it. You have a very, very serious job on your hands, and I'm just honored to be part of the process. As I already said, I'm not running against anybody, I'm running with everybody. You have an important job. You're listening to really, really fine people, all of whom are saying great things. I personally think it's really healthy for our democracy and healthy for the Democratic Party that so many people are running. This is an all-hands-on-deck type of moment. Anybody have some good ideas? Bring them on. But there's something mystical about democracy. It means that when the time comes for you to caucus, some states, for primary voters to vote, you're going to listen to that small, still voice within. That's what Gandhi said. Gandhi said the leader of the Indian independence movement was the small, still voice within. I'm honored, and I thank you for giving me the privilege of being able to speak into your listening. And I hope that you will hear me on the level of heart from which I have entered into this conversation. And whether you feel when you caucus or in other states when you vote that yes, this is a consciousness that I wish to have sitting at the desk in the Oval Office or not, I hope that you will feel that this conversation has added in some way to the life of our precious country. Thank you very, very, very much. Thank you. Thank you.